Hi everyone, welcome to my channel Code with Ease by Varsha. We will talk about auditing in the context of Spring Boot. Auditing is something similar to like you have version control system like GitHub, wherein you know who made the changes to your source code, when they made it, and what are the changes they have made. So basically you have a historical trail of all the changes that has happened to your source code. Similarly, for our data, for our persistence layer, we also do something called database auditing or audit tracking, whatever you may call. The reason being, we need to know who made the changes to the data, why they made it, okay, who made the changes, what changes they have done, when they made it. All of these questions are going to be answered if you enable auditing in your persistence. And how we can do that using Spring Boot is what we are going to focus in today's video. Remember, this is imperative for real world production applications, because from security breach perspective, troubleshooting production issues, maintaining the data integrity, and also in some companies in terms of compliance and regulatory requirements. So without further ado, let's begin. All right, so let's begin. So why are we doing this? We need to understand what is auditing, why do we need it, right? So the very simple reason is you need to track changes to your data. Now, data in every organization is very important, it's very critical. And people who work with PHI or PII, so organizations like healthcare organizations, or, fintech organizations, for them, data is business, data is the oil, that data is the money. So we have to safeguard that. And auditing, since it helps us to track the changes and it helps us to understand all of these, who created data, when was it created, who updated, because it helps us to answer all of these critical questions. So it becomes like indispensable from security and compliance point of view. Of course, it also helps in production issue debugging, troubleshooting, all of that. But for certain organizations, security and compliance is like the topmost priority. Of course, it is the priority for every other organization, but for certain kind of organization, like I work in fintech, so I understand how important auditing is. And we have seen the implications of having this auditing in place, which has helped us in so many, closing of audit points. Like we have reviews and auditing, which is done by third party organizations to understand whether we are safeguarding our data in the right manner and if we are tracking all the changes which is being done. Of course, there are DBA teams who are trying to safeguard with all the policies and tools and everything. But at the very same time, it is important for developers also, for them to integrate the right tools and libraries so that we can track the data. We can track the changes that has been made to the data. So auditing helps us to answer all of these questions which is written, and it is invaluable for security, debugging, compliance, business intelligence. These are, like we said, these are the use cases in which auditing is super critical. You have to know this. Next is Hibernate Envers. Now, as I said, we need some tools and libraries to achieve this functionality. We are not doing anything from scratch. We are not reinventing the wheel. So Hibernate Envers is that dependency which we need to add for doing this, because it prevents us from manually creating any kind of audit tables, which is that audit table is the main entity, the main hero of this entire video that we are doing. This audit table is what is going to keep the version history, the tracking changes of all the things that we have done with our data. So like, we have issue tracking system, like we have Jira, right? So it helps us in tracking. We have version control system, like we have GitHub. You can think of it in the similar terms for our the actual business of our organization, which is the data. So it is helping us to track the version changes to our data. So this is what we will use today. So we don't have to manually create any tables, or we don't have to write any code. Envers is the dependency which it does. How it does? So basically it will create shadow tables, which is suffixed by _AUD. These are the audit tables, which is just like a shadow of your main entity or your main table, to store the historical versions of the data, so that you can do the change tracking whenever you're doing any kind of CRUD operation. These changes or these actions will be intercepted by Envers, and they will create a snapshot of the data, like before the change, what the snapshot, like what is the version of the data it was, and then it is going to save it in the audit table. And of course, it helps in data retrieval so that you can, play around with all the historical versions. But mainly, this is how it works. We'll go even deeper into how it works. So what we will do in this demo, basically we will have a database interaction where we will do some CRUD operations. We will activate auditing. Okay, we will enable the auditing. We will track the changes, like if we are doing an insert operation, then what happens? If you're doing an update operation, then what happens? And we will see how the AUD tables are getting created and how it is storing a history of the changes that we are doing. So the project setup is basically going to contain these three things. Important is Hibernate Envers. And of course, when you're working with database, you have to use Spring Data JPA and Spring Boot. H2 database is again optional. The focus of this video is not about what database you're using. You can use a cloud database. I mean, you can use AWS or some GCP run database also. It is not, this video is not about database connection or what database you're using. Database is optional because H2 is the simplest one to set up, easy and quick to understand for everyone. So that is why you can use any database actually. So the third point is actually it's something of your choice. If you want to practice this, I would suggest that you actually try it out with some other database. So next is enable auditing. So now we will go a bit into the low level details of the annotations and all the changes that needs to be done, so that when we do the code demo, it becomes easier for you to relate. So this is the annotation which we will use to enable the JPA auditing, because this will tell Spring to enable the JPA auditing. Without this, it is not going to work. And we will write this inside a configuration class. Next is the auditor aware bean. Now, as we have discussed in the above questions, that who created a record, who updated it, this is important, right? So this auditor aware, there's an interface which is going to tell us the current user, like the logged in user, that who is that entity who has changed my record, who has created a record. Okay, so usually we return the username of the logged in user. So what we will do for that is we will create a concrete class which will implement the auditor aware interface. We'll register that as a bean, and we will whenever an entry will be done, we will see that the created by and the updated by columns are getting updated with the username, whoever is doing that, right? So that is about these two non-negotiable changes which we have to do. Next is the base auditable entity. Now these fields, remember these fields, these four things: created, date, created by, updated date. Now these four fields are the things which we are going to track, and since these will be common across all the entities, that is why we are going to put it inside a base class called auditable, and we will extend that base class in every other entity that we are using. So what are the annotations which we are going to play around with? These are the different annotations. You can just pause and read this, what is doing what. It is self-explanatory. I don't have to read it out. So when we are extending our auditable class, the other classes will automatically inherit these fields and the auditing behavior. Next is the actual entity which you want to track. So you have to create the entity with the Envers audit. So over here, another new annotation which we are going to work with is @audited annotation. So let's say you have an entity called employee. Annotating it with @audited will tell us that you have to create an audit table, which is the name of the entity, and then _AUD. Actually, this suffix, you can also customize it accordingly, which will store the historical versions, and then automatically it will create a snapshot of that data in the AUD table. So when you don't use this @audited, and if you use @JPA, @enable JPA auditing, it is not going to work. So each of these annotations are important, step by step, which we are going to see. Then the database setup, any database of your choice, we are using H2 in this case. So now how audit tables work under the hood. So as we have said, the audit tables will be created, which will be mirroring your, shadowing your entities. So now we have seen that this audit table employee _AUD is getting created. So now what happens when we are doing the database operations, the CRUD operations? So in case of insert and update, it will insert a new record in the audit table, which will contain the data before the change. Because after the change, you are anyway getting reflected in the entity. And for updates, it's the data before the update. In case of delete, when you delete the record, it will, depending on the configuration, it will either insert a final record in the audit table with the data before deletion, or mark the existing audit record as deleted. This is again depending on how we are trying to customize. Revision information. So there are two tables which are going to, actually there are three tables which we have to look at. One is the main entity table, which is the employee. Next is this AUD table, the audit table. And third, which you have to also take a look at, is the rev info table. So in the rev info table, which we will look at in a while. So now, what is the column apart from the columns which we already have in the main entity? The audit table will also contain the rev type column. So this is important. You have to know the values, the possible values of this rev type column: 0 for insert, 1 for update, 2 for delete. So these are the three operations which we usually do in our CRUD operation. So if it is 0, it is insert, 1 for update, 2 for delete. Now coming to the rev info table. This is also managed by Envers. What it does, it will store the information about each revision. Like, as we have said, the changes which was existing in the entity before you made that operation. So it will store the information about each revision. So that is the each change that you have made. So there are two columns mainly: the revision ID or the rev, which is the primary key of the rev info table, but this is going to be the foreign key in the AUD tables, and the timestamp when it happened, the date and time. So the timestamp and the revision ID. And this revision ID is what you are going to refer to in the audit tables. So every time a change is made, a new entry is added in the rev info with the ID, the rev timestamp, and this rev type. See, the rev type, which is this, and the rev column, which is the revision ID. These two will be contained in the AUD table. So you have your rev type, what is the type of operation, and the rev ID. These two are in the audit table. And how are we going to refer to this rev ID? In the actual rev info table, which is going to tell us the timestamp. And it is basically going to, this is the main table, which is going to have all the primary key, which is the rev IDs and the timestamp. And every other details are created by, created timestamp, updated by, updated timestamp. All of this is going to be contained in the audit table. So this is the breakdown of the differences in the content of both the tables. How you can fetch all data. This is not in the scope of today's video, but just have added this for additional information that, like, we have an auditor aware interface. There's something called audit reader interface, which is going to help you to query the audit table. But so this API will allow you to query the audit tables, get the version, but this is something programmatically which you have to do. Usually in scenarios when we actually need the help of audit table, we don't use it anything programmatically, like we don't write an API or anything. We just go into the DB and we check it. But again, it's a business use case. It can vary from organization to another organization. So like, for example, you can write a query to get all the revisions of the specific employee, like all the changes which has happened, how the data has changed over time. This may be helpful in, let's say, business analytical purpose. Coming to the @audited annotation. So if you put this annotation on top of an entity class, all the fields will be tracked. All the fields will be audited. Okay, in the entity name in this format. But there's also another annotation called @not audited, which if you use on a specific field, it will exclude that field from being tracked. So fields that you may not want to audit, things which you don't have to audit, or you don't care about the history of that field. Then you have audit override. So these are used when your entity inherits the fields from superclass. Okay, so audit override is basically, this is for the child, parent child in the inheritance relationship. Let's say that there is a created by column which is in the base class, right? But you don't want that to be audited. So it's like on an entity to prevent the created by from being audited for that particular entity. So if you do not want that who created who created that entity, so who created that record, if you don't want that to be stored, then you can use audit override. And @audit overrides is used to apply multiple annotations if you need to override. Again, these are for inherited fields, the different customizations which you can do. We will focus on the main code demo on how to step by step set this up so that you are ready with the auditing changes that you need to do today with your data. So let's begin. All right, so we are into the IDE now, and let me show you the pom.xml first. So these are the 4 dependencies which we will need: the web and the JPA, of course. H2 we have added, and the Hibernate Envers. These are mainly the 4 dependencies which we have added. Next, I'm going to show you the config classes. So auditor aware, like we have discussed, the interface we have called auditor aware, and we are writing the implementation of that so that we are able to give an implementation for the get current auditor method, which is in this case just a simple hard-coded value of system user. Ideally, it should be whoever is the logged in user of your system, or again, depending on whatever your business logic is. of what you want to store in the created by column and in the updated by column. So this is about this configuration, a simple bean, provided the implementation, use Lambda functions. Now, next thing is the JPA audit config. So now when we are enabling the JPA auditing, remember the annotation which we talked about. Here we're passing in a reference of this bean, which is auditor aware. So whatever name you're passing over here, we are referencing this so that JPA knows that when the auditing is being enabled, this is the bean I have to use to resolve it and get the value of the get current auditor. Simple. So configuration is done. Also, let me show you the application properties. Very plain and simple logic properties that we have, the H2 console, the data source and everything. Nothing fancy. And the entity. So the base entity which we are using, remember, you have to create a base entity so that every other entity can extend this. So what are the annotations? These getter setter is fine. The important annotation is at the rate entity listener, and we are using this auditing entity listener class. Okay. So this is what it is going to, if you see all of this business logic, it is going to check if this annotation is present and create the aspects of, so you can just try to explore the class of what it is doing. So in this, we have 4 columns created by the created date and updated by an updated date. Okay. So these 4 columns are what we are going to see in our AUD tables. Now, if I go into the main entity, which is our employee, so over here, everything remains the same, just as you create a normal JP entity. The important annotation is at the rate audited. So let me summarize all the annotations which we have discussed so far. We need to have at the rate configuration class where we'll define the auditor aware bean. Now, in some places, people don't even do this and they just pass it on the go, like on the fly, from environment variables or properties when they're trying to set the JPA, when they're trying to save the JPA entity, right? So even then they can do it. But I would suggest it is a good practice to use this interface. Secondly, we need this annotation, which is at the rate enable JPA auditing. And next we discuss that in the entity in which we want to enforce the auditing, we have to use at the rate audited. Okay, so far so good. Now what we are left with is the controller and the repository, and we'll see the main class. So what we need for the purpose of auditing, the main things was whatever we have in this config classes. And secondly, we need to create a new entity and mark the all the entities which needs to be audited with at the rate audited. These are the important things which you have to do. Rest, everything else is plain and simple code like you write. Okay, going into the controller, a very basic controller, we have all the CRUD operations, which we will try to do one by one, create, update, and all of that. So I think I have shown all the important, all the classes that we have in this package. Now, all we need is to run the server, and let's go to our H2 console to see. Let me also show you the logs which is getting generated when we are starting the server of the tables that is getting created also. So let's wait for that. Yeah, so we are creating employee table. See, we are creating employee underscore AUD, in which these are the things which we will have. The rev column, remember the revision ID, the rev type, then all the employee related specifications. And this is the primary key which we have is of rev and ID. Okay. And this is the rev info table, which will have the rev column and the rev timestamp. And this is the primary key. So they are very clearly mentioned. These are the columns which we will have in the AUD. And in the employee table, so one thing, try to understand that when we created a base entity and employee table is extending this. So very obviously, whatever you have in the audit table, all of this is going to reflect in our employee table as well. So that is why in the employee table, we are seeing all of this. So let's say you remove the created by from the auditable, everything that is extending that auditable will not have the created by, right? So these are getting updated. So these are the 3 tables like we have discussed at the start, which is getting created. And if you see, we are also doing an alter to the employee underscore AUD table where we are adding a foreign key construct. What is that foreign key construct? The rev. Rev is the revision ID, which is the primary key of rev info, and a foreign key of the employee AUD or the employee audit table. So this is what I wanted to actually show you in action. Now let's go to our H2 console. To connect. So these are the tables that we have, and just run. It's empty, right? So now let's go to the postman and try to create an employee. So this is our curl. In the body, I'll just give the name and the department and let me hit. So as you can see, system user has been populated, date time has also been captured, and the name department ID has come. So now let's go to our H2 console and run this. So we are seeing the entries. Now let's go to AUD. Let's run a query on this. Okay, interestingly, we are seeing the ref type is 0. Now you have to correlate with what we have learned 0, 1, and 2, insert, update, delete. ID is okay, and this is REV is the primary key. So now let me go to the rev info table to see if there's an entry for 1. Yes. So this rev is the identifier, the foreign key, primary key, right? And this is the timestamp. Now we have done the create already. Let me create one more entry. So let's say Ryan. Okay. So we've created another entry, and if we go to, and if we run over here, we are seeing another entry for this. And let me go to the AUD table and run this, and we are seeing another entry for Ranju. Now, so we've seen the insert queries. Now let me try to do an update. So I'll take this scroll. So we'll try to update, and in the body, I'll just, so in this, I'm going to change the department to marketing. Okay. So I'm doing a put and we are doing an update. So update is done successfully. Now let's see what happens in the AUD. Okay. So now you see there is a rev type of 1 because we did an update and the new department is marketing. So the main thing which you have to see is in the audit table how apart from the rev, we also have the rev type and it is referencing the new column, the new row, the new changes in the data. And if I show you the rev info table, we should also have an entry for that, which is plain and simple. If I go to the employee table, we should have an update in the record. So now Varsha is in marketing. Okay. So we have seen the rev type of 0 and 1. Finally, we are left with one more, which is the delete. Copy this. So let's say I now want to delete the first employee. Okay. So let me fire this. 204. Okay, let me run this now. So employee Varsha is deleted. What happens to our AUD table? If I run this, you see there is a ref type of 2 which happened for ID1. We know that ID1 belonged to this row and the department are null because it is deleted. So of course there is no more, there's no object pointing to it, right? There's no record pointing to it. So by seeing this AUD table, you can make a sense. What are the things we have done? One, we did an insert to this row for this employee called Varsha. Then we did an update of the department for this employee. Then we finally deleted. So this is how we are tracking the history of the record. So this is what it is going to do. This is what it is going to help you to do, right? So this is what we wanted to discuss as part of the Spring Boot auditing video today.
Hope you guys have got some value out of it. Thank you so much for watching.